March 14, 1868. The Yenisei River Basin, eastern Siberia. When the spring thaw finally came to the forests near Krasnoyarsk, a group of fur trappers stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Partially exposed from a snowdrift, they found the frozen body of a man, dressed in the unmistakable striped uniform of a political exile. But he wasn't alone. Surrounding him in a protective circle were the bodies of 7 gray wolves. Their positions were deliberate, almost ritualistic. The man's hands were buried in the fur of 2 wolves positioned closest to him, as if they had tried to keep him warm in his final moments. Around his neck hung a crude collar made from prison chains, and scattered around the scene were the remains of shared meals, rabbit bones, deer carcasses, evidence of months of survival together. The trappers reported something else, something that made even hardened frontier men cross themselves. The man's face bore an expression of absolute peace, and carved into the bark of the surrounding trees were dozens of markings, a written record of a man who had chosen to live and die with wolves rather than return to human civilization. But the truth of what drove Mikhail Demidov into the Siberian wilderness, and what really happened in those final months with his wolf pack, was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the political prisoner who rejected humanity for a wolf pack, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history that most channels won't touch. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's descend into one of the most disturbing stories of exile, madness, and the thin line between man and beast. The year is 1865, and the Russian Empire stretches across 2 continents, a massive autocracy held together by fear, bureaucracy, and an extensive system of internal exile that would make modern totalitarian states envious. Tsar Alexander II sits on the throne, and while he has freed the serfs in 1861, political dissent remains absolutely forbidden. To speak against the regime, to question the Orthodox Church, or to advocate for democratic reforms means only one thing: Siberia. The word itself had become synonymous with suffering. Siberia wasn't just a place, it was a death sentence served slowly, over years or decades. The exile system processed thousands of prisoners annually, from hardened criminals to intellectuals whose only crime was writing the wrong poem or attending the wrong meeting. They were marched in chains across thousands of miles, through mountains and taiga forests, to remote settlements where escape meant certain death in a wilderness that stretched farther than most European countries combined. Mikhail Demidov was 32 years old when he arrived at the Krasnoyarsk exile settlement in September 1865. His crime? Publishing an essay questioning the divine right of the Tsar. In the salons of St. Petersburg, he had been a rising intellectual star, a student of philosophy and natural sciences, known for his brilliant if dangerous writings on social contracts and human liberty. His family came from minor nobility, which meant his sentence was commuted from hard labor to simple exile. He would not work in the mines. He would simply cease to exist in civilized society. The Krasnoyarsk region was particularly harsh. Located in central Siberia along the Yenisei River, it served as a way station for exiles heading even further east. The settlement itself consisted of perhaps 300 souls, a mixture of guards, administrative officials, earlier exiles who had served their terms but lacked the means to return west, and the newly arrived prisoners. Wooden buildings lined muddy streets. The forests pressed in from all sides. Winter temperatures regularly dropped to 40% below zero. The summer brought mosquitoes so thick they could suffocate livestock. Contemporary accounts describe Demidov as a quiet, studious man during his first months in exile. He worked as a clerk for the settlement administrator, translating documents and maintaining records. He shared a small cabin with 2 other political prisoners. By all accounts, he was adapting to exile as well as anyone could. The other exiles noted his morning habit of walking to the forest edge before dawn, staring into the trees as if searching for something. What they didn't know was that Mikhail Demidov was already planning something that no exile had ever attempted, something that would transform him from a civilized intellectual into something else entirely. In his letters to his sister in St. Petersburg, letters that would later be discovered and preserved by historians, he wrote increasingly strange observations. He described watching wolves from his window. He discussed how they moved through the forest with a social structure more honest than human civilization. He began to question whether humanity's so-called advancement had actually been a terrible mistake. "We have traded freedom for comfort," he wrote in November 1865, "and in doing so, have become the most imprisoned creatures on earth. Even the wolves in their harsh wilderness are more free than we are in our cities of stone." His sister would later tell investigators that she found these letters disturbing. She showed them to friends, who dismissed them as the understandable depression of a man torn from society. No one imagined that Mikhail was working toward a plan that would shock the empire and raise questions about the very nature of humanity that remain unsettling to this day. The first incident occurred in January 1866, during the brutal heart of the Siberian winter. A guard named Pyotr Volkov was making his rounds along the settlement perimeter when he witnessed something that defied explanation. In the dim light of dawn, he saw Mikhail Demidov standing at the forest edge, completely still, while 3 gray wolves circled him at a distance of perhaps 20 meters. The guard raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Demidov turned and made a sharp gesture, almost a command. The wolves immediately retreated into the trees. Volkov reported this to his superior, Captain Ivan Grigorovich, who documented it in the settlement log. Prisoner Demidov appears to have developed an unusual relationship with local wolf population. Recommended psychological evaluation. But no evaluation was ever conducted. The settlement had no doctor trained in mental health, and Demidov continued his clerical work without any apparent issues. The incident was filed away and forgotten. The second incident came in March 1866, and this time there were multiple witnesses. During a supply run to a neighboring settlement, the convoy was attacked by a wolf pack, a terrifying but not uncommon occurrence in the region. Wolves driven desperate by hunger would sometimes challenge humans for food. The guards formed a defensive position, preparing to shoot the animals. But before any shots were fired, Mikhail Demidov, who had been included in the convoy as a translator, walked directly toward the wolves. Guard Dmitry Sokolov later testified he walked toward them without fear. The lead wolf, a massive gray male, approached him. "I was certain we were about to witness a mauling, but instead, the prisoner knelt down. He extended his hand. The wolf sniffed him. They remained like that for perhaps 30 seconds. Then Demidov stood and made a sweeping motion with his arm. The entire pack turned and retreated into the forest. The prisoner returned to us and said only, they were not hungry for blood. They were curious. The convoy commander wanted to report this immediately, but the other guards convinced him otherwise. Demidov had potentially saved them from using valuable ammunition and possibly losing men to wolf attacks. Besides, what would they report? That a prisoner could communicate with animals? They would be laughed at. The incident was mentioned only in passing in the official log, but the other exiles noticed, and they began to whisper. By summer 1866, Demidov had become increasingly withdrawn from human society. He spoke only when necessary. He spent every possible moment at the forest edge. Fellow exile Andrei Orlov noted in his diary, later recovered by historians, that Demidov had begun to smell different. "It is as if the forest itself has claimed him," Orlov wrote. "He no longer bathes in the communal house. He brings raw meat from the settlement stores to his cabin, and I have heard him eating it without cooking it first. When I confronted him, he looked at me with eyes that seemed changed. We are the strange ones, he told me, not them." The third incident occurred in August 1866, and this time it couldn't be ignored. A search party was organized to find a young guard who had gone missing during a hunting trip. After 2 days of searching, they discovered his body in a forest clearing. He had been killed by wolves. The evidence was unmistakable. The body had been partially consumed. But beside the body, the search party found something that chilled them. Fresh wolf tracks, and next to those tracks, human footprints. Bare human footprints, despite the rough forest floor. The tracks led deep into the forest, far beyond where any exile would normally travel. The search party followed them for several hours before losing the trail in a rocky stream bed. But one member of the party, an exile named Boris Kuznetsov, who had been a hunter before his imprisonment, noticed something extraordinary. The human tracks walked among the wolf tracks, he later testified, not following them, not fleeing from them, walking with them as part of the pack. When the search party returned to the settlement, they discovered that Mikhail Demidov had been absent from his cabin for 3 days. He returned the following morning, his feet bleeding and raw, his clothing torn, carrying the personal effects of the dead guard. He claimed to have found them in the forest. He explained nothing else. Captain Grigorovich ordered Demidov confined to a cell while an investigation was conducted. but the evidence was circumstantial at best. There was no proof Demidov had anything to do with the guard's death beyond finding his belongings. The wolves had killed the man, that much was certain. And while Demidov's behavior had become increasingly strange, being strange was not a crime, even in exile. After 2 weeks of confinement, Demidov was released with a warning. He was forbidden from entering the forest alone. He was to be accompanied at all times when outside the settlement. His cabin would be subject to random searches. The settlement administrator, Alexei Pavlov, wrote to his superiors in Krasnoyarsk, "We have a situation developing that I do not fully understand. Prisoner Demidov has formed what can only be described as a relationship with the wolf population. Whether this represents a mental breakdown or something else, I cannot say. I request guidance." The response came back 3 months later. Continue observation. Document all unusual behavior. If prisoner becomes a danger to himself or others, use appropriate measures. By then, it was already too late. The fourth and final incident occurred on November 3, 1866, during the first major snowfall of the season. That morning, 3 guards found Demidov's cabin empty. His few possessions remained, his books, his writing materials, his winter coat. But Demidov himself was gone. In the snow outside his cabin, the tracks told a story that would become legendary. Demidov's bare footprints led directly into the forest. Surrounding his tracks were the prints of at least 5 large wolves, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of attack. The tracks walked side by side, human and wolf, into the wilderness. A search party of 20 men was organized immediately. They followed the tracks for 3 days, pushing deep into territory where even experienced trappers rarely ventured. The trail led up into the mountains, through dense forest, across frozen streams, and everywhere they went, they found evidence of a man living as a wolf. Crude shelters dug into snowbanks, the remains of kills that had been shared between human and animal, trees marked with symbols that seemed to be some kind of journal or mapping system. On the 3rd day, the search party encountered something that made them abandon the search. In a clearing, they found the wolves. 7 adults and 3 juveniles, sitting in a loose circle, watching the humans. And among them, barely distinguishable from the animals in his posture and stillness, sat Mikhail Demidov. Guard Anatoly Volkov, who led the search party, later reported, "He was naked from the waist up despite the temperature being well below freezing. His skin was covered in scars. His hair and beard had grown wild, but it was his eyes that stopped us. They were the eyes of an animal. When we called to him, he did not respond with words. He growled. The wolves around him grew agitated. The largest male stood and moved protectively in front of Demidov. We raised our rifles, but Volkov gave the order to retreat. He has made his choice, Volkov said. Let the winter take him. It is more merciful than forcing him back." The search party returned to the settlement and filed their report. Mikhail Demidov was officially declared a fugitive, though no further attempts were made to retrieve him. The winter was setting in, the mountains were becoming impassable, and the general consensus was that Demidov would not survive more than a few weeks in such conditions. But Mikhail Demidov did survive. For months he survived. And what happened during that winter would create a mystery that continues to disturb researchers to this day. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. What would drive a man to completely reject human civilization and choose to live as part of a wolf pack? Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries of the human mind. Now, let's discover what happened when spring finally came, and what authorities found in that frozen clearing that would challenge everything we understand about the line between human and animal. March 14, 1868. 16 months after Mikhail Demidov walked into the Siberian wilderness. The spring thaw came late that year. The fur trappers who discovered the scene, Nikolai Medvedev, his brother Ivan, and their partner Grigory Petrov, had been working a trap line about 40 kilometers north of the Krasnoyarsk settlement. They were experienced men, familiar with death in its various forms. The wilderness killed regularly and without sentiment. But what they found in that clearing would haunt them until their own deaths decades later. Nikolai Medvedev's testimony, recorded by authorities 3 days after the discovery, provides the most detailed account. We saw the wolves first. 7 of them, frozen in the snow, arranged in a circle. At first we thought they had died in a fight with each other, but there were no wounds, no blood. They were simply positioned, like they had laid down to sleep and never woken up. In the center of the circle was the man. We knew immediately he had been one of the exiles. The striped uniform was unmistakable, though it was in tatters. He was curled in a fetal position, his hands buried in the fur of the two wolves nearest to him. His face, God help me, his face was peaceful. Not the terror you usually see in freeze deaths. He looked content. The authorities arrived 2 days later, led by Captain Ivan Grigorovich himself. What they documented would fill 3 separate reports and spark debates in academic circles for years afterward. The physical evidence was extraordinary. The wolves, 4 adults and 3 juveniles, showed no signs of disease, injury, or starvation. They were healthy animals in their prime. The positioning of their bodies suggested they had consciously chosen to remain with Demidov, even as the cold killed them. Veterinary examination of the preserved specimens would later reveal they had likely survived for several days after lying down, slowly succumbing to hypothermia. Around the clearing, investigators found evidence of Demidov's life with the pack. Trees were marked with carved symbols, a mixture of Russian letters and pictographic images that appeared to document daily events. One series of carvings, dated by tree ring analysis to December 1866, showed stick figures of wolves and a man hunting together. Another series from February 1867 depicted what appeared to be a ceremony or ritual, wolves howling at the moon while a human figure stood among them with arms raised. Most disturbing were the personal modifications Demidov had made to himself. The crude collar around his neck was fashioned from his own prison chains, reformed and fitted to mimic a wolf's ruff. His fingernails had been deliberately sharpened, filed to points. His teeth showed signs of intentional modification. The front incisors had been chipped and shaped to create more pronounced points. Examination of his body revealed numerous scars consistent with hunting large game with primitive tools. Dr. Konstantin Lebedev, the regional medical examiner, noted in his report, "The deceased shows signs of extreme physical adaptation to wilderness survival. Muscle structure in the legs and back is significantly developed, consistent with quadrupedal movement over extended periods. Callousing on hands and feet suggests barefoot travel over rough terrain. Most significant is the condition of the jaw muscles, which are overdeveloped in ways inconsistent with normal human activity. It is as if the subject had been regularly using his teeth for purposes typically handled by tools or hands. But the most significant discovery was found in a carefully preserved leather pouch around Demidov's neck. Inside were dozens of pages, a journal written in cramped handwriting on birch bark and animal hide. This journal would provide the only first-hand account of what occurred during those 16 months in the wilderness. The entries began rationally enough. November 1866. I have left behind the pretense of civilization. The wolves accept me because I do not pretend to be more than I am, a predator seeking to survive. We hunt together. I am learning their language of movement and sound. By December, the entries showed increasing psychological transformation. I understand now what we have lost. Humanity's greatest crime was not the fall from paradise. It was the rise from nature. We climbed from the honest simplicity of survival into the complex prison of society. The wolves live in a truth we have forgotten. They kill without guilt. They protect without contracts. They exist without questioning existence. January 1867 marked a turning point. I have been accepted into the pack. The alpha male, whom I call Seri Gray, tested me 3 times, first by allowing me to feed with them, then by including me in a hunt, finally by defending me from a rival male. I have earned my place through action, not words. This is the most honest relationship I have ever known. The entries through spring and summer detailed his complete integration into the pack. He described learning to track prey by scent, to communicate through body language and vocalizations, to share kills according to pack hierarchy. He wrote about participating in the raising of the 3 juvenile wolves born that spring. He detailed the deaths of 2 pack members, one to a bear, another to infection from a porcupine injury, with the same matter-of-fact tone a human might use to report the weather. But by autumn 1867, the journal entries began to show awareness of approaching mortality. Winter is coming. The pack is strong, but I am not. My human body cannot endure what they endure. I have perhaps 3 months, maybe 4 if the winter is mild. I do not fear this. I have lived more truly in this single year than in all my previous life. When the cold comes, I will face it as they face it, with acceptance and without complaint. The final entry, dated February 10, 1868, was brief, The great cold has arrived. We cannot hunt. We are burning through our reserves. Seri is making the decision all alphas must make, whether to abandon the weak or remain together. I have asked him in the way we communicate to stay. If we die as pack. There is honor in this. There is love in this. More love than I ever found among men. 1 month later, investigators estimated Mikhail Demidov and his wolf pack lay down together in that clearing. As the temperature dropped to lethal levels, as the blizzard raged around them, they stayed together. The evidence suggests they survived for several days in that position, the wolf's body heat keeping Demidov alive hours, or possibly days longer than he would have survived alone. When death finally came, it came to all of them within hours of each other. Captain Grigorovich stood in that clearing and wrote in his report, "I have witnessed many deaths in my career. I have seen men die in violence, in accident, in disease, in execution. But I have never seen a death quite like this, chosen, peaceful, and shared with creatures we have always believed to be our enemies. I cannot say if prisoner Demidov was mad or if he had discovered some truth the rest of us refused to see. I can only report what was found and leave judgment to wiser men than I." The bodies were transported back to Krasnoyarsk. Demidov was buried in the exile cemetery with a simple wooden marker. The wolves were preserved and sent to St. Petersburg for scientific study. The journal was sealed and filed in the archives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, where it would remain largely forgotten for over a century. The official response to Mikhail Demidov's death revealed the deep unease his story created within the Russian bureaucratic and scientific establishment. The Ministry of Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation in April 1868, not to determine the cause of death, which was obvious, but to understand how and why a political prisoner had been able to completely abandon humanity and survive for over a year in the wilderness. The investigation lasted 8 months and involved interviews with over 50 witnesses, from the guards who first noticed Demidov's strange behavior to the trappers who discovered his body. The lead investigator, Colonel Mikhail Rodzianko, approached the case with scientific skepticism. His initial theory was that Demidov had suffered a psychotic break triggered by the trauma of exile. "It is well documented," he wrote in his preliminary report, "that isolation and extreme stress can produce various forms of madness. Prisoner Demidov likely experienced a delusional episode in which he believed himself to be accepted by wolves, when in reality he was merely observing them from a distance while slowly starving and freezing." But this theory collapsed when confronted with the physical evidence. Demidov had not starved. His body showed adequate nutrition consistent with a meat-heavy diet. He had not frozen slowly over days, but had survived an entire winter in the harshest conditions imaginable. And the wolves had undeniably been in direct physical contact with him at the time of death. Their positioning, the careful placement of his hands in their fur, the protective circle formation, these were not delusions, they were facts. Dr. Konstantin Lebedev, the medical examiner, pushed back against simple explanations of madness. In his supplemental report, he wrote, "While prisoner Demidov's behavior appears irrational by civilized standards, we must consider the possibility that he was, in fact, entirely rational within the context he had chosen. Wolves are social animals with complex hierarchies and communication systems. Is it impossible that a human, stripped of societal expectations and survival pressures, could integrate into such a system? History provides examples of feral children raised by animals. Demidov simply reversed the process, a civilized man choosing to become feral. This suggestion horrified the investigators. It implied that civilization itself was a choice, one that could be rejected. It suggested that humanity's separation from the animal kingdom was not a triumph of evolution, but simply a different survival strategy. In the rigid autocracy of the Russian Empire, where social order was considered divinely ordained, such implications were dangerous. The Orthodox Church entered the debate through Archbishop Dmitry of Krasnoyarsk, who declared Demidov's actions heretical. "God created man in his image and granted us dominion over the beasts," he wrote in an official statement. "To reject this divine gift, to lower oneself to the level of wolves, is to reject God's plan for humanity." Mikhail Demidov did not achieve some noble harmony with nature. He committed spiritual suicide, abandoning his immortal soul for base animal existence. The Archbishop's statement included a recommendation that Demidov's journal be destroyed as corrupting material that might inspire others to similar madness. This recommendation was seriously considered. Several members of the investigation committee argued that the journal's philosophical content, its questioning of civilization's value, its suggestion that humans might be happier in a more primitive state, was dangerous enough to warrant suppression. But Professor Anton Volkov of the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences intervened. Volkov was a natural philosopher who had studied animal behavior extensively. He argued passionately for the journal's preservation as a unique scientific document. "We fear this record because it challenges our assumptions about human nature," he wrote to the committee. "But science advances by challenging assumptions. Demidov's journal is the only detailed first-hand account we possess of a human living as part of a predator pack. Its scientific value is immeasurable, regardless of how uncomfortable its contents make us." The compromise reached was typical of Russian bureaucracy. The journal would be preserved but classified. It would remain sealed in the ministry archives, accessible only to approved researchers with specific authorization. This effectively buried it for decades. The guards and administrators at the Krasnoyarsk settlement faced consequences for their failure to prevent Demidov's escape. Captain Grigorovich was formally reprimanded and transferred to a less prominent post. 3 guards were demoted for inadequate supervision. The settlement administrator, Alexei Pavlov, was dismissed from service. The official position was that proper vigilance would have prevented the entire incident. But unofficially, many within the exile system understood that Demidov's case represented something unprecedented. Prison administrator Andrei Korsakov wrote in his private correspondence, "We exile men to Siberia believing that separation from civilized society is the punishment. But what if separation is actually freedom? Demidov found something in the wilderness that satisfied him more than anything in St. Petersburg ever had. How do we punish a man who does not view his exile as punishment? This question haunts me." The wolves' bodies, preserved and sent to St. Petersburg, created their own controversy. Dr. Viktor Petrov, the zoologist assigned to examine them, made several startling observations. The wolves showed behavioral modifications inconsistent with normal wild pack behavior. Their stomach contents revealed they had been sharing kills with a human over an extended period. The ratios of consumed meat suggested deliberate allocation rather than one species scavenging from another. Most striking was evidence of tool marks on several of the wolves' claws, suggesting they had been deliberately filed or trimmed, possibly to prevent accidental injury to a human pack member. These animals were not simply tolerating a human presence, Petrov concluded in his report. They had incorporated him into their social structure. They had adapted their behavior to accommodate his weaknesses, his inability to kill large prey alone, his vulnerability to cold, his slower running speed. This is not dominance or domestication. This is something we have no term for. True interspecies cooperation between predators. The implications of Petrov's findings were largely suppressed. The official statement released to the public described Demidov as a mentally disturbed exile who died of exposure while attempting escape. The wolves were mentioned only as incidental to the story, animals that scavenged near the body and themselves froze. The truth was locked away in classified reports. Among the exile community, however, Mikhail Demidov became a legend. Stories circulated of the man who rejected humanity to run with wolves. Some versions painted him as insane, a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation. Others portrayed him as enlightened, a man who saw through civilization's lies and chose a more authentic existence. Political prisoners began referring to acts of defiance against the system as going to join Demidov's pack. One exile, the poet Nikolai Chernyshevsky, wrote a verse about Demidov that circulated secretly through the prison system. He traded golden chains for iron chains for none at all. In the frozen wastes he found what we seek, brotherhood without walls. The verse earned Chernyshevsky an additional 5 years in exile, but it captured something important about how Demidov's story resonated with the powerless and imprisoned. Demidov's family received official notification of his death in May 1868. His sister, Ekaterina Demidova, traveled to Krasnoyarsk to retrieve his personal effects. In her diary, she recorded her visit to the site where her brother's body was discovered. The clearing is peaceful. Spring flowers were beginning to bloom. I could see why Mikhail chose this place for his end. He always said that human society was a cage, and that we mistake comfort for freedom. I thought he was merely being philosophical. I did not understand he meant it literally. Standing here in this vast wilderness, I wonder if he was right. We spend our lives in rooms in cities, convinced we are the masters of the earth. But perhaps we are just very sophisticated prisoners who have forgotten what freedom feels like. Ekaterina took Demidov's journal entries, those that had been released to her, heavily redacted, and published them privately in 1870 under the title Letters from the Wild. The small publication was immediately banned by censors, but copies circulated underground. The unredacted portions showed a man of clear mind documenting his transformation, raising uncomfortable questions about the nature of sanity and civilization that authorities were not prepared to address. The Krasnoyarsk settlement continued to operate for another 3 decades, but Demidov's escape changed protocols throughout the exile system. New regulations required increased surveillance, restricted access to forest edges, and mandatory psychological evaluations of prisoners showing excessive interest in wildlife. These measures were largely ineffective. The wilderness was too vast, the guards too few, and the human desire for freedom too strong. Several other escape attempts occurred in subsequent years, each referenced in official reports as potentially inspired by the Demidov incident. None of the escapees survived more than a few weeks. None achieved anything like Demidov's integration into the wild. Their frozen bodies were found alone, surrounded by the tracks of wolves that had avoided or killed them, not accepted them. This fact became its own mystery. Why had Mikhail Demidov succeeded where all others failed? Was it luck, skill, something in his personality that allowed communication across species barriers? The question remained unanswered, locked in classified files alongside his journal and the scientific reports on his wolf pack. The case of Mikhail Demidov and his wolf pack resonates far beyond one man's choice to reject civilization. It raises fundamental questions about human nature, the costs of society, and the boundaries between species that continue to disturb us over 150 years later. From an anthropological perspective, Demidov's story challenges core assumptions about human development. We teach that civilization is progress, that the movement from hunter-gatherer societies to complex agricultural civilizations represents advancement. But Demidov consciously reversed this trajectory. A highly educated intellectual from one of the world's most sophisticated cities deliberately chose to live as a predator in a pack. And by all evidence, he was happier. Professor Helena Voroshilova of Moscow State University, who gained access to Demidov's journal in the 1990s when many Soviet-era archives were declassified, wrote extensively about the philosophical implications. Demidov forces us to confront the possibility that civilization's benefits come at an existential cost we rarely acknowledge. We have security, comfort, and entertainment, but we have lost the intense present-moment awareness that comes from survival-oriented living. We have complex relationships, but perhaps none as fundamentally honest as the pack bond Demidov described. His choice was not mad. It was a different optimization of what makes life worth living. The psychological community has debated Demidov's mental state since the case became widely known. Was his transformation a form of dissociative identity disorder, a psychotic break, or was it, as some contemporary psychologists argue, a rational response to existential crisis? Dr. James Morrison, author of Feral Minds, Humans Who Reject Humanity, argues, Demidov was not delusional. He clearly understood his situation and made conscious choices based on his values. He simply valued authentic existence and freedom over comfort and safety. This makes many of us uncomfortable because it suggests that our daily acceptance of civilization's trade-offs is also a choice, one we could reject but choose not to. The biological aspects of Demidov's case remain equally fascinating. Modern research into human-animal communication has shown that pack animals like wolves, dolphins, and primates can indeed form social bonds with humans that go beyond simple training or domestication. Dr. Sarah Chen, a behavioral ecologist, notes, what Demidov achieved, true integration into a wolf pack social structure, has been partially replicated under controlled conditions. Researchers living with wolf packs over extended periods have documented acceptance behaviors similar to what Demidov described. The difference is that modern researchers eventually return to human society. Demidov never did. The physical modifications Demidov made to himself, the sharpened teeth and nails, the deliberate strengthening of jaw muscles for tearing meat, demonstrate how quickly the human body can adapt when civilization's constraints are removed. We think of ourselves as physically fixed, explains evolutionary biologist Dr. Marcus Thompson, but we're actually quite plastic. Our bodies adapt to the demands we place on them. Demidov essentially retrained his body to function in ways we've forgotten are possible. It's a reminder that human nature is more flexible than we typically acknowledge. From a historical perspective, Demidov's case influenced thinking about exile and punishment in late imperial Russia. Reform advocates pointed to him as evidence that exile to Siberia did not achieve its intended purpose of isolation and suffering. If prisoners could find freedom and meaning in the wilderness, the punishment lost its power. This contributed to broader debates about the exile system that would eventually lead to its partial reform in the 1880s. The story also intersected with broader Romantic movement ideas circulating through Europe at the time. Thinkers like Thoreau and Rousseau had philosophized about returning to nature, about the corrupting influence of civilization. Demidov actually did what they only contemplated. His story spread through underground networks of political dissidents, becoming a symbol of ultimate resistance against systems of control. Similar cases emerged in other contexts over the following decades, though none quite matched Demidov's complete transformation. In 1912, a German deserter from the colonial army in East Africa was discovered living among a lion pride, though he died shortly after being found. In the 1930s, Soviet researchers documented several cases of children who had survived in the wilderness with wolves, though these were victims of abandonment rather than conscious choice. In each case, authorities struggled with the same discomfort Demidov's story generated, the suggestion that civilization might not be the unquestioned good we claim it to be. Modern environmental psychology has embraced aspects of Demidov's experience as evidence for nature deficit disorder, the theory that human disconnection from natural environments causes psychological distress. Demidov took it to an extreme, explains Dr. Patricia Lee, but his core observation that humans are happier with regular immersion in natural environments has been validated by extensive research. We're animals adapted to wild spaces who have trapped ourselves in concrete boxes. The stress this creates is measurable and significant. The ethical implications of Demidov's choice continue to generate debate. Did he have the right to reject his humanity? If we accept that consciousness includes the right to end one's life, does it also include the right to fundamentally alter how one lives? These questions become more relevant as technology offers increasing possibilities for human modification and as environmental collapse makes some people question the value of maintaining civilization at all costs. Perhaps most disturbing is what Demidov's peaceful death suggests about the relationship between happiness and survival. We structure our entire society around the assumption that longer life is better life, that comfort and security are paramount goals. But Demidov chose a life he knew would be shorter and harder because it felt more meaningful. He died at 34, frozen in the snow. But his journal suggests he considered those final 16 months more valuable than all his previous years of educated comfort. This inversion of values, prioritizing meaning over longevity, freedom over security, remains profoundly threatening to social order. If people genuinely believe they might be happier rejecting civilization, why would they continue supporting its institutions? It's a question every social system must suppress to function, and Demidov's story forces us to confront it directly. The final implication may be the most important. Demidov's story reminds us that the boundary between human and animal is not as clear as we pretend. We like to imagine ourselves as fundamentally separate from other species, defined by culture, language, and reason. But Demidov demonstrated that a human can learn to communicate with, cooperate with, and ultimately identify with members of another predator species. The gulf we perceive is at least partly a construct of our own making, maintained by choice rather than biology. Whether this realization is liberating or terrifying depends on how much of your identity is invested in humanity's special status. Demidov chose liberation. The rest of us, for better or worse, continue to choose the terror of comfort over the freedom of the wild. What do you think drove Mikhail Demidov to completely reject human civilization and choose death with his wolf pack over return to society? Was he mad, or did he understand something fundamental about human nature that the rest of us refuse to acknowledge? Leave your theories in the comments below. Our community always has fascinating perspectives on these dark chapters of history. If you found this story as haunting as I did, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon for more forgotten stories that challenge everything we think we know about human nature and history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. What other dark mysteries from history should we explore? Let us know in the comments, and remember, the scariest truths are often the ones that make us question the foundations of how we live. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the real horror isn't what happens in the darkness, but what it reveals about the light we take for granted. See you in the next video.